Today's lecture is going to be on the Semele Massacre and its aftermath. Now, this period of Assyrian history is one of the most tragic in a history full of tragedies, but it has also inspired a lot of reflection, a lot of hope in the future, in uniting the nation behind a strong identity that has survived the attempts to destroy it by various forces. You have to remember that when this massacre happened, this attempted genocide, the Assyrians were coming off of a horrible experience in the First World War period, where 2/3 of their numbers were lost. So it was a particularly tragic incident when the Assyrians thought that they had settled down, sometimes away from their homes, where the the League of Nations at the time, along with Britain and Iraq and what was left of the Ottoman Empire, the newly created Turkish state, were hopefully working towards a resolution of not only their relations with each other, but also to the Assyrian question that lingered on after the First World War. And their hopes were dashed at the time of this massacre. And we're going to get into the details of the Simele Massacre right now. So we are told by various people, and I'm quoting here from a PhD dissertation by Russell Hopkins, the sources show that the violence against the Assyrians in Semele and other Assyrian villages at the time was genocide, authorized by the king himself, that's King Faisal of Iraq. The ethnic cleansing in Iraq was the continuation of a state-sponsored practice that began under the Ottomans. Remember what the Assyrians experienced under the Ottomans, and became worse during the First World War. Already under suspicion due to their association with the British military, something we will get into in detail, the Assyrians became an easy target for mass violence at the direction of the new state. After the dissolution of the empire, the Iraqi government followed a nationalist agenda to solidify support for the new Sunni Arab regime and to resist British imperialist efforts, statedly so. Through the lens of nationalism, Iraqi state leaders and others constructed the Assyrians into an internal threat and instituted a campaign of mass violence against them, principally at Semele, but also in villages across northern Iraq. And what we have to remember, and what is very, very important to point out, is that the people who became the victims of Semele and its surrounding massacres, who were killed, were innocent civilians. This was not a battle. It was not a war in any sense of the word. This was pure and simple massacre of people who had given up, who had disarmed themselves, who had pledged their loyalty under the Iraqi flag, to the Iraqi flag and to the Iraqi state, and were in no way anticipating that the military, along with the police and Iraqi tribes, Kurds, Arabs, and unfortunately Yazidis as well, would participate in the destruction of their villages, the killing of their sons and daughters unarmed, the execution of priests, including the beheading of some of the priests, the raping of women, and the looting and destruction of their villages. They never anticipated that this would happen. So let's find out, first of all, what happened exactly that led to Semele, who became the victims in the Semele Massacre and its surrounding villages, what led to it, what was the reason that this Semele Massacre happened. And I want to emphasize this third point because it's very important to know that there are many among Assyrians themselves who point fingers at their leadership and lay blame for the events of the Semele Massacre at the feet of certain Assyrian leaders. And we're going to find out whether that is true or not. Who were the responsible parties for the Semele Massacre and its surrounding massacres? And what happened afterwards? How did the Semele Massacre and the elimination of the force that was left among the Assyrians, the armed Assyrians, how did this impact the existence of the Assyrian people in Iraq and elsewhere? And what did it do to the Assyrian national movement, which we had talked about in previous classes? So it's important to ask, first of all, who were the Assyrians? And oftentimes we see the authors of various books, including people like, for example, John Joseph and Stafford, differentiate between various Assyrian groups. The fact is that all of the Assyrians were one. However, our people were divided at this time along sectarian lines, and sometimes these divisions bred different policies, similar to the way we see, for example, political parties take different steps towards resolving a solution. In the same way, Assyrian leaders, primarily religious leaders, but also secular in some cases, and in the case of Marshamun, who was the head of the Church of the East, this was a temporal and spiritual leader. He wasn't simply a religious leader in the sense that, for example, the Patriarch of the Chaldeans and the Patriarch of the Syrian Orthodox and Syriac Catholics were. He was, unlike these other patriarchs, had a special status, and this special status was referred to by the League of Nations, by the British, and by others. It was contested, of course, later on, as we'll see, by the Iraqis and the British, who changed their minds down the line. But it was a custom among the Assyrians, and it was well known. So those who say, for example, well, religious leaders can't be, secular leaders, spiritual leaders cannot be temporal leaders, this was simply not the case among a particular group of Assyrians, and that happened to be the Assyrians of the Hakkari and Urmi Salamas area, who pledged loyalty to Marshamun, or the seat of Marshamun. In this case, was Marshamun Binyamin, who was assassinated by Simko, along with over 100 Assyrian bodyguards. Then his brother takes over in 1918 and unfortunately dies soon afterwards. And then a young Mar-Ishe Shummun at age 12 takes over as the patriarch, the boy patriarch, in 1920. And he is tossed into a very difficult situation. And the Assyrians, unfortunately for them, are dispersed not only geographically, but they are split in terms of leadership, and there is not much cohesion among them during this time. The Syriac Orthodox and the Syriac Catholic churches are led by Mar Ignatius Ilyas in the beginning, just prior to the Semele Massacre, and Mar Ignatius Avid Aloho II for the Syriac Catholics. And all of the Assyrians, as we mentioned before, had suffered. It didn't really matter if they were Syriac Orthodox or Syriac Catholics or Chaldeans or Church of the East. All of the Assyrians together had suffered. As divided as they were along sectarian lines, the truth is that the Ottomans, along with their supporters, the Kurds, and other Muslims, such as the Azaris, took turns in trying to destroy the entirety of the Assyrian nation during the First World War period. And it's one of the unfortunate reflections on on the state of the Assyrians is that many of them thought that it was they, their particular village, their particular tribe, their particular ethnic religious group that was being attacked. But the truth was that all Assyrians were being attacked. In fact, the war was against all Christians during the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Eastern Anatolia, which has become Turkey. Well, that was the policy of the Ottomans. Well, what was the policy of the French and the British during this time? So the British came to Baghdad as liberators, sympathizing with the political aspirations of the Arab people. That was stated, and it was on this that the British came into, along with the French, came into the Middle East, and with the stated reason of being liberators of these poor people who had been the victims of the Ottomans during this time. Complete and final emancipation of all those people so long oppressed by the Turks or the Ottomans, and to establish national governments and administrations which shall derive their authority from the initiative and free will of the people themselves. Of course, this was hogwash. This was not the intention of the British and the French. This was the stated reason. But as we will see, the British had their interests in these countries. Now, if certain things, certain developments were reflective of what these stated goals were, fine, as long as they didn't get in the way of British dominance in the Middle East and the French as well. But if they got in the way, as we will see when Mar'isha Shumun tries on behalf of the Assyrians to obtain something like autonomy and a return to the Assyrian homelands that his people lived in. Once the Assyrians were doing that, they quickly learned that the reaction of the British, along with their Iraqi proxies, one could say, was that it was unacceptable. Now, the strike against the Assyrians was that they had participated with the British in ruling Iraq. Soon after entering the territory that became Iraq, and I want to emphasize to you that it wasn't that the Assyrians were crossing borders, it was that the borders were being created to cross the Assyrians. So once the Assyrians came into these areas, which later became Iraq, the British used them. And the conscription of young Assyrian men in large numbers into the levies to subdue Kurdish and Arab tribes created a lot of resentment towards the Assyrians. The Assyrians were viewed by many who became later very nationalistic Arabs and even Kurds as being proxies of the West, as being really an appendage of Great Britain inside of Iraq, which was very detrimental toward the Assyrians, as we will see. Now, along with the British and the French, the American president Woodrow Wilson, came out with this idea of self-determination. I'm telling you all of these things because you've got to keep them in mind to understand the volatile situation being created here that one could see would cause something like the Semele Massacre to ignite. So Wilson's rhetoric was self-determination for non-Turkish nationalities, really non-Ottoman nationalities, which were ruled under the Ottomans. This was eventually changed to more paternalistic language on the part of the Americans and on part of the Westerners, to be sure. And the ideals that sparked these Wilsonian movements or ideas eventually would transform into a more realistic understanding of what the Middle East was. Remember, the Americans initiated something called the King Crane Commission, which sought out people to try to understand what did they really want. Not that it had much of an effect on the situation on the ground, given that the British and the French were much more involved than the Americans. But the Americans wanted to know through the King Crane Commission, what exactly was it that minorities wanted? And of course, those Assyrians who had encountered people in the King Crane Commission stated, and among them was the patriarch of the Chaldean Church, who stated that an autonomous type of government, a Syro-Chaldean government, would be a good thing if possible. Of course, this later changed. So Assyrians from Hakkari and Urmi were placed in refugee camps right after the war, and oftentimes for the Iraqi government, this also caused resentment because they were coming from, interesting that the leadership of the Iraqis was either Ottoman or originally from Saudi Arabia, from the Hijaz Hashemites, for example. They themselves weren't from this territory, yet they judged the Assyrians because the Assyrians had lost their homes, had lost their wealth, had lost all of their assets, had lost large parts of their families as sort of refugees that were really dependent on the Iraqi state, and they should be grateful for anything they have. This type of attitude towards refugees, as you know, is very common, not just during the 1920s, soon after the First World War period, but also really in all times. Many people look at refugees as a menace. And certainly it did not help the Assyrians that they were Christians in a predominantly Muslim area. 1920 was the failed attempt at nationhood among Assyrians. Even though the British had supported it initially, Agha Patros and Malik Khoshaba leading this effort with close to 10,000 Assyrian troops had led to a disastrous split in the end, and this was in October of 1920, and Assyrians unfortunately were not able to do anything despite the assistance rendered to them by the British, and they managed to come back. Certain ones came back largely from Urmia, but certain Assyrians remained in the Hakkari Mountains past the 1920s until they were ousted by Turkish forces in 1924 and 1925. Now, before Semele, the Assyrians also tried to participate in the Paris Peace Conference, and among the Assyrians who supported the creation of an Assyria, the creation of a political entity, was Mar Afram Barsum, the bishop of the Syriac Orthodox, who later, when he became patriarch and after Semele, decided to renounce all links with his Assyrian people, anyone using the term Assyrian, and opted to use the term Syriac as a more formal term, distancing himself from the word Assyrian, because in his words, it really would lead to our people suffering a great deal of harm, just like the harm suffered by the Nestorian Assyrians. So this word was a British creation, he said, and we want nothing to do with it because look what happened to our brothers in the Church of the East. We don't want that to happen. So he's distancing himself for the safety, the stated reason of the safety of his people, and so distanced himself from the Assyrian movements, whereas before he had participated in the Paris Peace Conference and sought to assist in the creation of an Assyrian homeland. Now, what was this effort? And of course, John Joseph with whom I communicated and about whom many Assyrians do not have nice things to say. He was an Assyrian who did not believe that modern Assyrians descended from ancient Assyrians. Nevertheless, he had some good observations. He felt that the view of Assyrians in America, people he called super patriots, among them Joel Warda, Reverend Joel Warda, and others, were, in his words, totally out of touch with the true state of affairs that surrounded their people in the Middle East. And you could see a map here that I've seen reproduced over and over again in different places that the Assyrian committees that were put together to the Paris Peace Conference advocated. Now, admittedly, this map is rather unrealistic because it encompasses not only the Hakkadi territory, but goes all the way to the Euphrates and possibly even to the Mediterranean Sea, extending to the Mediterranean and then into the middle of Mesopotamia. This was, according to John Joseph, clearly not a realistic goal. It was simply something that one could consider the people who advocated for it were out of touch with reality. Now, these people, we must remember, were in the United States and other Western countries. This plan was not coming from Assyrians on the ground, as it were, although these people, such as Yuel Warda, Captain or Colonel A.K. Yusuf, and others, were in touch with people in the Middle East. Now, during this time, as we get closer to the 1930s, the British and the Ottomans, what's left of the Ottoman Empire, of course, is now a Turkish state. The British are pressing to include, in general, and I'm not going into a great deal of detail here so as to confuse you, because there's a lot of back and forth in these negotiations and depending on who the actors are. But by and large, the British were pressing to include the Hakkadi for their own advantage, of course, into the newly created Iraq state and away from the newly created Turkish state. And then pressed for, and of course, the Turks in turn were pressing for Mosul, the Mosul Wilayah, to be included in the new Turkish state rather than the Iraqi state. And so back and forth, Assyrians being caught in the middle. Turkey wanted Mosul, it pressed for it. The British wanted the Hakkadi area, and they pressed for it. Lord Curzon wanted Assyro-Chaldeans to be, quote, in Turkish territory or want to go back to the place in Turkish territory near Jalamark where they originally were. And so really on their behalf, we have to create a British protectorate, again, in the interest of the British. The Turks, of course, did not accept this. I'm going to sort of cut to the chase here. Bottom line, the Mosul Wilayat was given to Iraq, although there were, again, negotiations back and forth, and the Hakkadi area was given to the newly created state of Turkey. Not given, but taken by the newly created state of Turkey. And the Assyrians who had remained there, remember the attempt of 1920 in October, when Assyrians tried to reclaim their territories, the Assyrians who had remained, largely in Tiari and Khuma, were expelled from those territories so that none remained that we know of from this period in the 1920s. They all wound up going back to Iraq. And so the Turks, for their part, felt that the British are playing games because they went back and forth. And here we have Fethi Bey, the Turkish prime minister, telling the British, Your Excellency, having expressed the desire to resume negotiations at a point at which Lord Curzon left them at Lausanne, there were further negotiations, now abandons this attitude and raises a new question, that of the future of the Assyrians. To secure their future, you ask for the annexation under British protectorate of certain territories which are now under the flag of the Turkish Republic. That's the Hakkadi area. To say that this demand does not astonish me would be a perversion of the truth. So at no point did Turkey accept a protectorate for the Assyrians by Britain within its territory, and in fact, really tried as much as possible to take Mosul also. Now, just to be clear, and probably some of you can ask a question at the end of this presentation, at no point was Mosul promised to the Assyrians. At no point were the Assyrians told that the Mosul Wilayat would belong to them. But sometimes there are these rumors circulating that at one point the Mosul Wilayat was promised to the Assyrians. I heard this growing up. I heard it at various even political gatherings, but really the record does not bear this out. And in other classes, we will get into detail about these negotiations back and forth between the British and the Ottomans and other parties, the League of Nations commissions and so on. Really, there is not the evidence that Mosul was promised to the Assyrians. At best, the Assyrians were to receive a form of autonomy, such as they had enjoyed before in the Hakkari Mountains, having suffered for it. And the British were expected to be sympathetic to this because, after all, the British wanted the Assyrians to be on their side, to be sort of a bulwark against the advance of the Ottomans at a time when the British were in Mesopotamia, busy with warfare, trying to displace Ottoman power there. So the Assyrians were, along with the Armenians, acting in the interest, it was thought by the British, acting in their interest. So the Assyrians were an important, although not the most important, certainly an important theater of war. And it was expected by European powers that Britain would be sympathetic to the claims of the Assyrians in a modest sort of way. In other words, to enjoy a type of autonomy under the jurisdiction of either it was going to be the Mosul, newly created Mosul Wilayat under the Iraqis or under the Turkish government, newly created Turkish government. Now, the British, for their part, and this is from two British officers, the British, for their part, criticized the Assyrians as being disorganized. And the Assyrians will hear this again and again in different, in different settings as they try to negotiate for their rights at different times. And Colonel Cunliffe Owen tells us the difficulty about the Assyrians was that they had no reliable leaders and no unanimity among the various elements to effect repatriation as a whole. Colonel Stafford tells us there is no doubt that it has been one of the greatest misfortunes of the Assyrians that in the years immediately following the war, they did not possess a strong and experienced leader. Now, the British, for their part, should be blamed in part because they tried to undermine such leaders, as we will see. And the ones that were disliked the most by people like Colonel Stafford were Mar'i Shumun and Malik Yaqub Ismail of the Upper Tiari. And that was because they resisted the recommendations of the British at every turn as they changed according to their interests in terms of vis-a-vis the relationship they had with the Iraqis. As the Anglo-Iraqi treaty was signed and the interest of Britain lay with Iraq, it was much more convenient for Assyrians to simply listen and take orders and take what they can, and rather than insist on something that had been, even if it had been promised to the Assyrians. And the Assyrians certainly thought that it was. Now, Mar'i Shumun, as we said, was consecrated patriarch at the age of 12. You see him there with Mar Yosef Khnanishu to his right and Mar Sergis, the Bishop of Jilu, to his left. And he was obviously very young, to be consecrated in 1920. And this caused a conflict among the Assyrians themselves. For example, Marti Matthias, who was considered by some, namely, and by himself, of course, Marti Matthias was the metropolitan along with Marios Khnanishu, and he was not invited to the consecration. And he is quoted as saying, if this Ishe, quite a simple child, is made patriarch, we will never accept him as such until and unless it has convinced us that he is made patriarch according to the canons and customs of our church at present, and that he is acceptable by all our congregation and nation in general. And what this meant was that the Assyrians, even within the Church of the East itself, were split. There was division among them. Now, later, Marti Matthias, who was metropolitan, would accept the leadership of Mar'i Sheshumon reluctantly, but he would accept it, and he would go off to become the Archbishop or the Metropolitan of India, and he would pass away there at a much later time and not cause the church any more trouble. But he had met with Agapatros and wanted to play a role and was concerned about the closeness of the patriarch and the patriarchal family with Britain, and at times accused the patriarchal family of being too much in association with the British and too attuned to the interests of the British rather than the interests of the Assyrians, and felt also at times that Mar'i Sheshumon had, quote unquote, sold the church to the British. Surma Khanum was also an important Assyrian leader at this time, given that the patriarch was very young, and many people among the British especially had a very high opinion of her. She spoke and wrote English. She was fluent in Assyrian and a number of other languages, and we are told by Colonel Owen that her name is well known to many in England. As she came to this country in the autumn of 1919 to plead the cause of the Assyrian nation, she was received in all the influential circles and remained at home until the autumn of 1920. An educated and exceedingly intelligent lady, she would no doubt have achieved great things for her nation had the times been more perpetuitous. As it turned out, however, her prolonged absence rather augmented the disunion of the people, and after all, what they really needed was a determined and single-eyed male leader capable of welding all the diverse elements together. End of quote. Now, Surma Khanum did her best, but she was opposed within the Assyrian people as a leader, even though her nephew, Mar'i Sheshumon, was patriarch at this time. The truth is that she wielded a great deal of influence. And it just so happened that she was at odds with Agapatros. Agapatros had told a number of people that he was unhappy with the church claiming temporal power, with the patriarch claiming temporal power, even though the patriarch would argue that this was a power, as we will see later on, that was given to him by his ancestors. It was a tradition that the Assyrians had followed, something that Agapatros did not agree with. Now, the supporters of Marshamun initially were Malik Loku of Tkhuma and Malik Yaqu of Upper Tiari, who were going to play an important role prior to the events surrounding Semele. Malik Khoshaba and Hakim Baba Parhad were of a different disposition. They wanted to deal with the Iraqi government, and they wanted to placate the sentiments of the demands of the Iraqis. And we are looking at a passage from a book on Iraqi leaders written by the British. the Assyrian chief describing Malik Khoshaba this way: Assyrian chief of the Lower Tiari tribe, aged about 55, Presbyterian, and generally in disagreement with Marshaman. Well educated by American missionaries at Urmia, a striking personality with romantic record as a fighter and leader, supported the Iraqi government in their efforts to settle Assyrians satisfactorily in Iraq, and thereby incurred the bitter enmity of Marshaman. Many of his followers were, however, quite innocently massacred in 1933 in spite of their friendly attitude toward the Iraqi government. So these people who, as I said, who had given their weapons up, who had disarmed themselves and pledged loyalty to the Iraqi government and hoisted an Iraqi flag above their village in Semele, were the people who became the victims of the massacre in Semele, as we will see. And these were the followers, in part, of Malik Khoshaba. And Marshaman, of course, his interest was that the settlement of the Assyrian question must be a comprehensive one. Marshaman was not acting simply as a patriarch interested in the sect of the Assyrians, in the religious rights of the Assyrians. He was interested in creating something that was a comprehensive settlement for the Assyrians, working with the British and negotiating with the Iraqis. And at times he pressed the British by encouraging the mutiny of levy forces of Assyrians, to which the British, of course, reacted with a great deal of hostility and did not certainly agree with Marshaman. Now, what were the demands of Marshaman? Unlike the demands made in the Paris Peace Conference and the map that was drawn, which was very extensive and included territories which were not always inhabited by Assyrians, the demands, in short, by Marshaman were that the Assyrians be recognized as a nation that was domiciled in Iraq and not merely as an Iraqi religious community. And this is very important for the position of temporal leadership, that the Hakkari Sanjak area in Turkey, in which some of the Assyrians formerly lived, should be annexed to Iraq and its villages restored to the Assyrians. This is what the British wanted, not necessarily in the interest of the Assyrians, but in the interest of Britain. That if this could not be done, a national home should be found for the Assyrians, which should be open to all the Assyrians scattered in Iraq and to all other ex-Ottoman Assyrians from all over the world. That this new home should be arranged to include the whole of the Ahmadiyya district, the adjacent parts of Zakho, Duhok, Aqra district, that it should be made into a sub-liwa or a sub-governorate under the Mosul governorate or liwa, with its headquarters in Duhok under an Arab mutasarrif and a British advisor. So here, Marshaman and the leaders who agreed with him is giving both sides, the British and the Iraqis, what they wanted by trying to take away as much as possible from Turkey, the Hakkari, and if this is not done, then we want to be under Iraqi and under British leadership, but we want this type of settlement to be one that deals with us as a people. In other words, I don't want my people, as advised by Malik Khoshaba, to be simply settled willy-nilly all over Iraq. That is not acceptable to me. I want a settlement that is collective. I want a settlement that gives us autonomy as a people. And unlike other Assyrian leaders who were willing to accept to be simply as they were, as other Iraqi Christians may have been and were happy to accept, Marshaman was not willing to accept this. Existing settlement arrangements should be wholly revised by a committee provided with adequate funds, and that the land chosen for Assyrian settlement should be registered in their names as their own property. That preferences should be given to Assyrians in the selection of officials in this sub-liwa. There were other demands. And of course, Marshaman was interested in maintaining his leadership. Unfortunately, the Assyrian demands were rejected, and the Iraqis had formed good relations with other sects of the Assyrians, other denominations of the Assyrians, and were able to use this as a way to pressure even the members of the Church of the East who adhered to the leadership and agreed to the leadership of Mar-Ishe Shumun. Even within them, there was a split, as we pointed out, with Malik Khoshaba and others who supported him. Mainly, in that case, it was members of the lower Tiari. And when Marshumun tried to obtain the type of legitimacy that he wanted to bolster for himself and for those who supported him, to ask for the rights that Assyrians wanted to be given by the British and to be conceded to by the Iraqis, he was opposed by people like Malik Khoshaba and Mario Ala and others, largely at the instigation of the Iraqis, but also the British. Remember what Stafford commented, that the Assyrians are just not able to have the necessary leadership. And of course, when the British and the Iraqis play into splitting the Assyrians along various lines, it's easier to make that kind of claim and to renounce any type of agreement with the supposed leadership. So Malik Khoshaba, along with others, tells us that Marshumun only represents a small number of his relatives and his own family, and we represent the communities and people mentioned against our respective signatures. We submit this document and request that Marshumun's demands not be taken into consideration and that we be permitted to live in peace and tranquility under the Iraqi flag. And this was in 1932. And remember what is coming next. So as I said, diplomacy or division with the Iraqis. Faisal seeing here the hierarchy of the Chaldean church. And of course, the Chaldean church became very frightened at a certain time as the Iraqi state grew, and as British support for the Iraqi state grew, and as treaties were arranged between Britain and Iraq, the leadership of the Chaldean church felt that really there was no other choice but to accept, and that no comprehensive solution could be had for the Christians of Iraq as a whole, Christian Assyrians. And this is leading, of course, to a great deal of desperation in 1931 on the part of Mar-Ishe Shumun, who tells the British that the condition of our nation has been fully made known to you through official workers of our nation. This being so, we do not see it necessary to relate every condition in detail, but we are positively sure he's talking about the targeting of various Assyrians at various places in Iraq. We are sure that if we remain in Iraq, in a few years' time, we shall be wiped out of existence. This being so, we implore your mercy to take care of us and to immigrate us to one of the countries under the rule of one of the Western nations, any one of which you may deem proper. And if this is not possible, that you may request the French government to accept us in Syria and take us under its responsibility, because we can no longer live in Iraq and we will leave. So remember now, there is a growing sentiment on the part of many Iraqis, as we are told by Yusuf Malik in his British Betrayal of the Assyrians, a great book, that the parties in Iraq have taken part in an anti-Assyrian campaign, and this is going on for a number of years. Public announcements by various parties were made and broadcast throughout the country. Hatred of the British, of the Assyrians because of Britain was becoming a a very important point that was being made by many politicians inside of Iraq. And many articles were written against the Assyrians, and various number of these articles were racist. And I will show you just a couple. And this one is made, this is a statement actually made by a member of parliament on June 28th, 1933, before the Semele Massacre. Gentlemen, I have to throw light on the public opinion. Now, this is made in Arabic. It's been translated, especially on that of our press regarding this misleading name Assyrians, which is in common use. As you are aware, this term is only recently coming into being. There is nobody who reasonably deserved this name. If there is any, we are first to grasp it. In other words, the Arabs of Iraq, as we are the original inhabitants of this country, and take this from the physical and not political point of view. The same question arises in Egypt. It is called the Pharaohs, but really Mosul is Arab even before Islam. I regret to note that our press still stick to this mysterious name. This group, which calls itself Assyrians, should be named Tiaris. They intermingle with the Assyrians and Chaldeans. This is confirmed by their being bilingual. If, for example, there is any of them who can decipher the tablets maintained in our museum, he can make us believe that they are descendants of the great Assyria, and on. Now, this type of hatred for Assyrians, this type of attempting to undermine them, it wasn't simply a matter of their leaders. This was a growing hatred. It was a type of nationalism, virulent nationalism that took place in Iraq, in part against the British, but since no one could attack the British, the Assyrians became an easy target for this type of hatred, combined with the fact that Assyrians were Christians. It was much easier for Muslim leaders who were nationalistic Arabs to pitch this message to the Iraqi people and to the Iraqi government. This wretched and corrupt people, this member of parliament continues, was housed and fed in Iraq. Why weren't they grateful? Remember, I alluded to this earlier. And expected to be loyal and dutiful subjects, but on the contrary, after being surfeited and ungrateful to the hospitality shown by their hosts, claimed humorous rights. Experience, however, shows us that these are armed to the teeth and are in a position to inflict the severest blow on the government. Along with the hatred of the Assyrians and thinking that their rights are humorous rights, in other words, laughable rights, there was a great deal of fear of the Assyrians because they were thought to be very dangerous and very potent warriors in the Iraqi state. And rumor had it that, you know, an Assyrian could take on many Arabs or many Kurds. And so this fear was being generated and was being played upon by these politicians. We are not so coward, but we wait to see what steps will be taken against those interlopers. What is the government's attitude towards them in this respect? In other words, placing pressure, and why she keeps quiet and postpones their punishment, and to make it known from what source they obtain their arms. We therefore request and recommend that they're being stripped of their arms forthwith, or at least arm their neighbors for defensive measures. In other words, arm the Kurds and others who live around them. We cannot clearly understand the program of their settling together in Zibad area. This is where, by the way, the villages of Nala are. The government further sanctioned 13,000 dinars for their settlement, and the settlement officer intends to settle some of them in the Barazan area, as though we dislodge the Barazanis to make room for those and to breed the poisonous germ in the head of the government. These will, at any rate, be an obstacle in the way of the government. We therefore should scatter them in all the liwas to be able to rule them peacefully. We cannot understand that they imagine special status, but they cannot be attained to, and we cannot at our will create a difficult situation similar to that already created in Palestine. In other words, a reference to the Zionists. So there is this building up of hatred toward the Assyrians. They are, after all, Christians, along with nationalism. So it is religious. This hatred is based on religious animus, but it's also based on nationalistic animus. They are foreigners. They are claiming an identity that is not theirs. They are refugees. They should be grateful. And the sooner we get rid of these very dangerous people who are armed, the better off we will be as a state. The Assyrians themselves, of course, had thought that they had made a mistake at a certain time by relying on the British. And this is a letter from the British levies. Many have thought that we were a foolish nation, lacking the ability to understand that it was not our attachment to Britain that made us bring ruin upon ourselves till this day. Many British politicians have declined to open the door for us when they could have, so that we could live as a community in harmony and peace with our neighbors. Now, one leading figure in the Assyrian question during this time was Hikmet Suleiman. He was the Minister of Interior at this time, and later became the Prime Minister. And he, in a very clear letter, asks Marshamun, recognizes the letter is a very important letter that asks Marshamun to tells him that Hikmet Suleiman and the Iraqi state accept his spiritual role, but they will not accept his temporal role. And Marshamun answers him and tells him that the temporal power, in an explanation, the temporal power has not been assumed by me, but it has descended to me from centuries past as a legalized delegation of the people to the patriarch. It was not only tolerated, but also officially recognized in the past by the old Sassanid kings, Islamic caliphs, Mughal khans, and Ottoman sultans. No proof of any misuse of this power as far as any king or government whose subjects in the Assyrian people have been can be traced in history. On and on. What Marshamun is saying is that I cannot give up this temporal power because I have been entrusted to be the representative of my people, and I have to search for a solution to their plight. So you cannot dissuade me from maintaining this power. You cannot destroy the Assyrian leadership that is agreed to by the majority of my people. Of course, the Minister of Interior at this time was greatly irritated by Marshamun, and it was he who worked with Bakr Sidqi, who became the person who committed the crime in Semele, who became the person most involved with the Semele Massacre and tried to commit many other crimes against the Assyrians. And this is a man who Stafford had feared that had expressed the most anti-Assyrian sentiments. He was Kurdish by ethnicity, but he was an Ottoman officer and he was an Arabized Kurd. Later, he was accused of conducting or pushing for a pro-Kurdish policy. In response, he claimed his Arab origins and linked himself with Ja'far al-Askari, another government official. He was also close to the British, and at times the British praised him, even after the Simele Massacre, as being a very competent leader and supported him in general. Tensions were building with the patriarchal family, and eventually Mar'i Shumun, the recognized leader of the Assyrians by many of the Maliks, by many of the people, even though there was opposition to him within the Assyrian nation, was eventually arrested in Iraq. In Baghdad, he was placed under house arrest, and eventually, as Stafford tells us, the Iraqi troops were sent against Assyrians to put them in line, as it were. And then he regrets, of course, many years later, 15 years later, after he writes his book. He says, I must admit that it was with very considerable misgivings that, when consulted in Baghdad, I agreed to the employment of the army. The army officers were known to hate the Assyrians, and in particular Bekr Sutqi, who was in command of the north and had openly stated what he would do to them if the opportunity occurred. Actually, it wasn't just Bekr Sutqi, it was many of the people that the British were working with. And in his dissertation, Russell Hopkins tells us that Stafford explained that the clash of personalities he's described was one of the triggering events of the Assyrian genocide in Iraq. Clearly, he's cognizant of his own involvement in the situation, but claims at each step, as events unfolded, that it was his aim and that of the British and the Iraqi government to avoid bloodshed. That claim by Stafford was either an uninformed opinion or a lie, since Faisal had authorized the massacre and various Iraqi ministries had been circulating leaflets among the Kurdish population, calling them to massacre the Assyrians as early as 1929. So these events didn't simply unfold in a vacuum in 1933 when disagreements with Marshamun prompted the Iraqi government to lead its army to try to punish the Assyrians and settle order in Iraq. These things had been going on for quite some time as the attempted settlement of the Assyrians was taking place inside of Iraq. And then the Semele Massacre, of course, happened in August of 1933. So the Iraqi government placed Marshamun under house arrest and sent troops against Assyrians loyal to him. Assyrians are informed that if they do not agree with what Iraq is offering, they can leave. After a few skirmishes between Assyrian irregulars and the Iraqi army, in which the Assyrians inflicted a number of casualties, the army, under the leadership of none other than Bekr Sutqi, and with the tacit approval of the Ikha, or the Brotherhood government, began to round up unarmed Assyrians for summary executions. Massacre of thousands of men, women, and children, and these were unarmed people who had surrendered to the Iraqi army in and around the villages of Semele. The Iraqi army, by the way, offered money to people who can bring in Assyrian heads to show that they had killed certain Assyrians, and many Assyrians were rounded up. Innocent, unarmed Assyrians were rounded up, thinking that they were being called to go somewhere or another, and they were shot and killed. A similar massacre was planned by Bekr Sutqi in Al-Qush, north of Mosul, but failed due to the embarrassment caused to the Iraqi government and Britain. So he decided to give up at that time. Thousands of Assyrians, mostly those who were loyal to Marshamun and those who had engaged in combat against the Iraqi army, had crossed the border of Iraq and settled in French-controlled Syria. These remained in northeastern Syria and formed a relatively homogeneous Assyrian community there. And these are the Assyrians that eventually left after ISIS came. And in this map, we can see the various places that, when we talk about the Simele Massacre, we're not talking about one location. We are talking about over 60 or 70 locations where Assyrians were targeted and killed. And the numbers are in the thousands. And this was after the Semele Massacre. Of course, the Iraqi government, along with the British, tried to whitewash the whole affair. Remember now, Britain was not the one responsible for the affair, but it certainly led events to develop in such a way that it could be said that they were very negligent in allowing things to happen in a certain way. They possibly hoped that the Assyrians could be punished enough, not with this type of bloodshed, to fall in line, as it were, with what the Iraqi government wanted, because after all, the British had ruled Iraq. And Stafford tells us, and by the way, Stafford, writing this book, The Tragedy of the Assyrians, 15 years later, reflects that very few events have transformed him as when he sees on August 17, soon after the massacre, the women and the girls coming out of places where they had hid. The sight of those girls and those women, the victims of massacres, all their husbands, brothers, sons, fathers being killed, never left him. And he tells us that really that it was one of the worst sights, and it's something that he could not get out of his mind, even in the French trenches when he participated in the First World War period. He had not seen such a horrible image as the Assyrian women and girls who were escaping from the Semele Massacre. A cold-blooded and methodical massacre took place, and men in the village then followed a massacre which, for the black treachery in which it was conceived and the callousness with which it was carried out, was as foul a crime as any in the cold-blooded stained annals of the Middle East. The Assyrians had no fight left in them, partly because of the state of mind to which the events of the past week had reduced them, largely because they were disarmed. Of course, it's important to point out that these were the people that the British and the Iraqis had encouraged to give up their arms. This is very important. Had they been armed, it seems that certain that Ismail Abawi Tohalla and his bravos would have hesitated to take them on in a fair fight. Having disarmed them, they proceeded with the massacre according to plan. This took some time. Not that there was any hurry, for the troops had the whole day ahead of them. Their opponents were helpless, and there was no chance of any interference from any quarter whatsoever. Machine gunners set up their guns outside the windows of the houses in which the Assyrians had taken refuge, and having trained them on the terror-stricken wretches in the crowded rooms, fired among them until not a man was left standing in the shambles. In some other instance, the bloodlust of the troops took a slightly more active form, and the men were dragged out and shot or bayoneted to death, and their bodies thrown in a pile of the dead. Again, it is important to recall that these are the Assyrians who surrendered their arms and pledged loyalty to the Iraqi government. These were not the Assyrians who fought because they felt that the Iraqi government did not want them inside of Iraq and had decided to leave, picked up their arms and had left. Remember, these were the victims of genocide during the First World War period, and now Iraq is subjecting them to further genocide. Very planned and plotted, as I read to you from the statements of Iraqi parliament members and statements even made by the British as to how members of the Iraqi military felt about the Assyrians. It's very important to remember that this was very well planned. Marshamun in the Assyrian tragedy tells us girls were raped and made to march naked before the Iraqi commanders. Children were run over by military cars. Pregnant women were bayoneted. Children were flung in the air and pierced on the points of bayonets. Holy books were used for the burning of the massacre. And who is said to encourage this massacre? This simply was not the work of Bakr Sidqi alone. Hikmat Suleiman, whose origins, by the way, were Circassian and Georgian, along with Arab. He was an former Ottoman officer, declared to the writer, and this is Majid Khadouri in his book, that he had approved the general line of policy which General Bakr Sidqi adopted. So Hikmat Suleiman, the Minister of Interior, along with other members of parliament, and we must remember that when the Simele Massacre took place, these officers who killed women and children and beheaded priests, unarmed men in one room, 81 Assyrian men were killed, machine gunned to death, and their bodies were taken and piled and then later burned in the site in Semele. These were unarmed men who were killed at the instigation of not only the military, not only Bakr Sidqi, but one could say Hikmat Suleiman, who had worked very closely with the British. Although again, it wasn't the British who committed the massacre. They may have looked the other way, but it's important to look at this very carefully and see the hatred created by many nationalists within the Iraqi government and this type of sentiment they stirred up. Eventually, the Assyrians who left, who were not willing to give up, crossed into Syria and built villages along the Khabur, which regrettably, of course, less than 100 years later became victims to the onslaught of ISIS, under the eyes of the United States and other Western powers. And all of these villages were taken over. And it was a very tragic, very, very tragic event that these people who had sought refuge from the First World War period, from the Semele Massacre period, and sought refuge in Syria and built their towns and had succeeded in creating their villages and their lives, became victims again of ISIS this time. Now, what impact did Semele have on the union of Assyrians, such as it was? Of course, as I said to you, Mar Afram Barsoum, who had advocated for Assyrian rights, now said that the Assyrian name is an English Protestant invention going back to 1900. It was bequeathed to the Nestorians in the regions of Mosul, and so we should not have anything to do with it. The sufferings of the Nestorians in 1933 is referring to have endured as a result of their nationalism. So nationalism is a bad thing, that if the Jacobites wish to avoid the same fate, meaning members of the Syriac Orthodox Church, they should disassociate themselves from Assyrian nationalistic activity. Now, Mar Yosef Emanuel, the patriarch of the Chaldean Church, at first, as we said, had advocated the creation of an Assyro-Chaldean homeland, or an Assyrian homeland in the north in 1919. Later, he changed his mind, clearly because of the Semele Massacre. And in fact, he had seen British officers, and there are various documents that we will go into detail in other classes, which talk about his dislike of the methods used and the demands made by the leadership under Mar-Ishe Shamun for the Assyrians. Now, what the Simele Massacre and its aftermath created was a rise in the Assyrian leadership overseas. So in particular, in the United States, organizations gathered, and in other countries, songs were sung, poems were written, books were written about the Semele Massacre, and all of these cultural and political and social movements created a greater cohesion among the Assyrian people, who were becoming dispersed all over the world. So Semele began as a tragedy, but ended as perhaps as a small ray of hope for the Assyrians to maintain themselves by adding to their experiences, as tragic as they were.